All right, time to talk about the virtues. So, as we'd mentioned, a morally good act is good in its object, good in its intention, and good in its circumstances. And that is very difficult. A lot of times, the devil's in the details, and our intentions and our circumstances are tainted by our vices and by other influences in which the devil is drawing us away from the good that God has intended for us. Right? But God didn't leave us without defense. Right? He's given us the virtues to combat those vices with. Right. And in addition to those virtues, I'll quickly say that God has also given us the sacrament of confession. So one of the beautiful things about confession is that we examine our conscience. And the more often we go to confession and the more carefully we examine our conscience, the more clearly we'll be able to see the vices that motivate our actions, right? Where we can see the fear that motivates us, the pride that motivates us, the sloth, the laziness that motivates our actions or our lack of actions. And we can take those to confession and we can say, God, I have done these things for these reasons. Forgive me, give me the virtues rather than to replace the vices, so that I can more readily say yes to your will and to live perfectly as you have called me to live. Now, the virtues then are in many ways the opposite of the vices, and they are literally muscles, right? Virtus means strength. So the idea is that God gives us muscles that we can exercise, right? That we can build, and that are present in our lives in various ways, but you use them or you lose them, right? You either strengthen them and you grow in your spiritual rectitude and your spiritual power, or you let them go and you kind of become the spiritual couch potato that lives out of the vices more than out of the virtues in our hearts and in our souls. So these virtues are muscles meant for us to live out the life that God has called us to. And with that, some of these virtues are what we call theological virtues. And what that means is that they actually cannot be attained by us through our own efforts. They are gifts come directly to us by God. Right? There's no way that we can gain these without having received them from God the Father. And these three theological virtues are listed in 1 Corinthians 13 as the three things that will remain when everything else passes away. Right? Faith, hope, and love. Right? And the greatest of these is love. And if we think about these components, they do not exist without God, the ultimate source of love, God, the ultimate source of all that has its being. And unless God loves us and reveals them to us and gives them to us, we cannot find them out of our own efforts. And there's something mysterious about that there are people who have looked for faith and yet have not received it, right? At least at this point in their lives. And I've met people like that who see a goodness in a faith, but they haven't found it, they haven't seen it. And so with these three, faith, hope, and love, they really all have to do with our relationship with God the Father, right? Our relationship with the source of good and the ultimate good, and being in right relationship with that source of good. So first of all, faith, right, means that we see and know the goodness of God in our lived experience, right? In our past and in our present, we recognize the goodness of God and we respond to it. Right? That's living in faith. It has nothing to do with things that are that might be true or might not be true. It has to do with recognizing the goodness and the truth of God that is concretely present in our lives and living and responding to it, right? Living it out. So it's very much a relationship with God in our lived experience. That's what we mean when we say faith. When somebody has a strong faith, it means that they see God in their present life. Right? Hope is the recognition of the good, the recognition of God in things yet unseen, things not lived out yet, right? Things that are still to come. Right? In Hebrews, in the letter to the Hebrews, faith is described as the substance of things hoped for. Right? So hope is that which is the faith that is going to happen still, right? And we have not yet experienced it, we have not yet seen it, but we know it's coming. Right? Faith, on the other hand, we have seen, we have experienced the goodness of God in our lives, and so it's we can think of faith as the relationship with God in past and present, and hope as the relationship with God for things future. We can see out into the future and we can see God there. We can see his plan and his goodness, even when in the current situation we have no evidence and no experience of that goodness of God. And that's what we mean by hope. Now, sometimes hope is isolated from faith, where because our present is so dark and so distressing, it is hope where we see God. It is the future where we start to intuit the goodness of God and being present with us. And we say, God, I will yet praise you. I know in the future I will see you again. Right. So that's hope. And love is encompasses all of that. It's the essence of our being with God, the essence of what God is to us and what we are to God. It has no time, it has no limits. It is who we are in God and who God is in us. So love is the hardest one of these virtues to explain, and yet it's also the one from which all other virtues stem. Right? It infuses all of our other virtues. It's when we live out our faith and our hope in love, when we live out the cardinal virtues, which we'll talk about shortly, in love, that's when God is present in our lives most fully. And as I mentioned, all of these gifts all of these virtues come directly from God, and we can't attain them on our own. They, by their very nature, require a relationship with God. Right? We can't just say, I'm going to make these out of my own. They require God coming to us, and in a way they require a lack of effort from us, where we say, God, I'm open to receiving your faith. God, I'm open to receiving your hope. God, I'm open to receiving your love. Right? It's a lack of effort. It's an openness to the will of God. And then the human virtues, the cardinal virtues, in many ways are our response to that, what we have received from God. It is our human efforts that we then use to build God-given virtues within our life. And these human virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Now, you might call them other things, right? Or there are other virtuous elements in our lives, but these are kind of the ones that our tradition comes back to, and that Aquinas, for example, builds in great detail on these 7 virtues: faith, hope, love, and prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. And you'll notice that there's a difference between the theological and the cardinal virtues, where the cardinal virtues are really, in a way, secondary to the theological virtues, and they are less directly connected with a relationship to God the Father, and more with building our human strength, right? Our human moral strength. And like I said, the theological component and that love of God must infuse these virtues for them to be perfect, but they have a different quality and a different character to them. So with that, we have, let's start with justice and fortitude. Right? Justice is right action. Right? And so that ability to discern, is this act objectively and subjectively the one that God has called me to do, right? The one that I ought to do, the good one. And can I recognize that, and can I do that? Right? So that's living out a life of justice, giving to each what they are due, right? The love that they are due, the respect that they are due, the discipline that they are due. A lot of times, this justice can be warm and fuzzy, or it can be challenging, right, to live out. And fortitude is kind of the strength. I mean, it means strength. It is the strength of being able to act, right? Having that courage to do what is difficult when the just act requires your strength, or more than your strength, or that requires courage. We talk about the virtue of fortitude. Now, the other two, temperance and prudence, I think are both very valuable when we talk about the quality of an act, right? The circumstances of the act. Prudence meaning that you look at the circumstances in which you find yourself, and you know how to respond to that particular set of circumstances. And so when you're looking at a certain act, you recognize what the limiting factors are, what the extent to which you can do the good act that you are looking at doing, and doing that well. Right? And temperance is the same, specifically towards quantities, right? Tempering your disappointment, or tempering your response to whatever circumstances you find yourself in, and knowing how much can I do, how much can I not do. There's a certain element of wisdom, right, in both prudence and temperance. So we have these cardinal virtues which are inherent within us, right? We all have these. And then the question is, how much will we respond to God by actually exercising these and putting our effort into becoming more prudent, becoming more courageous, right? Becoming more just. And how do we build these? Well, it's through embracing the corporal works of mercy and the spiritual works of mercy, right? Praying for the people around us, that would be a spiritual work of mercy. And the corporal works are from Matthew chapter 25, and those include visiting the sick, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, going, visiting the imprisoned, clothing the naked. Let me see here. I have them listed here somewhere. Which ones am I missing? Visiting the sick, imprisoned. Oh, of course, the last one that often gets forgotten is bury the dead, which is actually an act of justice, right? Giving them what they are due, giving the body of the person who has died the respect that that body created by God deserves, even at the end when that human being no longer has any agency over their body. Right? So living out these virtues is a way of exercising them. Right? Being just to the people around you, being prudent, right? Being temperate in the way you live out these things. It's whenever you, the way you build muscle is to go out and work, right? To go out and build your muscle, whether it's out in your occupation or in a recreational way in a gym or something. You build your muscles by working. And Jesus gives us these corporal works of mercy, and we have the spiritual works of mercy too, instructing the ignorant, counseling the doubtful, admonishing the sinner, bearing wrongs patiently, forgiving offenses willingly, comforting the afflicted, and praying for the living and the dead. So both with our actions and our physical actions and our spiritual actions, we orient ourselves to God, right? We orient ourselves and say we choose living virtuously rather than living in vice, and then we do it. And we, as we do these things, we grow in our virtues. Right? We grow in those human virtues. But again, regardless of how much we work towards these works of mercy for prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, the theological virtues and that relationship with God cannot come from our works of mercy. Those come from receiving the love of God, receiving the gifts that God has for us, and being open, always open to receiving God more fully and more freely in our lives. So I hope all of that makes sense. I know I covered a lot of information in a fairly short period of time. And if you have questions, feel free to email or to write comments or to talk to me when we see each other next, wherever and whenever that may be. And I'll just wrap it up here and hope that all of that was helpful for you. I miss you, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.